bad news is we've only got 2 weeks left of this quarter to finish. We're in Acts 22, if you want to turn there, to finish the rest of Acts. So how many chapters is that? Is this 22, 23, 24, 25, 26? Use my fingers. Can we cover 7 chapters in 2 weeks? Considering sometimes we can't even cover one chapter in 1 week. Hey, the good news, you only have me for 2 more weeks. That's the good news, right? I didn't hear any amens. That's good. All right, so we're in Acts 22. By the way, I'm going to go ahead and pass this around if you want to be a part of the Grow Ministry. There's a lot of cards there as far as sending out cards, calling. I think those are the actual visits. I don't think are with that stack. I think you have to go over to the Welcome Center to get those. So, all right, so we're trying to play catch up, like I said, and we'll kind of hit a few highlights, but we probably won't go super in depth as we have been just because of the sake of our time. But if you have certainly questions or comments, feel free to stop and make those known. I'm going to ask a few questions. So we start in Acts 22. We're actually going to skip back a little bit in 21 just to kind of recap what's going on. This is sort of after Paul he's been on his 3 missionary journeys. He's now in Jerusalem. He's run into some trouble in Jerusalem. He's been arrested. Why has he been arrested? What is going on as we start Acts 22 and his sort of defense? What is going on? What has he been accused of? Anybody remember? Right. That was one of the things is, there were some Jews, I think it said from Asia, and they had made, sort of caused a rioting going on because Paul has brought this, I think he was an Ephesian, what's it, Trophimus, I think is the name there. They accused him of bringing him into sort of the temple and violating the temple and the laws and things like that. So he desecrated the temple ultimately. And so they, as you'll remember, so they drug him out. They were ready to essentially kill him. And then who steps in? The Romans, essentially the Roman commander sees what's going on, sees the sort of the confusion and drags Paul or sort of takes him to the barracks or whatever he may have to sort of protect Paul from the mob at this time because they were ready to kill him. And you see at the very end of 21 into 22, Paul is now, as sort of they're taking Paul away, Paul stops and he's going to ask, can I speak to the crowd? And so that's sort of where we pick up in Acts 22, where he's going to speak to the crowd to sort of make his first defense to the mob. And so let's take a little bit of look at that in 22. This is mainly what we would look at as the second account of Paul's conversion story that he'll mention here. Before we read that, let me ask this question. What is the differences? I'm sure some of you've read Acts 9 and then Acts 22. Is there a difference? I guess not super detailed differences, but like what is the difference between Acts chapter 9 and Acts chapter 22 as far as Paul's conversion story? What would be sort of a big significant thing that maybe that you've heard in the past or been pointed out there from that particular story? Like I said, sometimes people getting caught up in some of the different details of whether the men heard, whether the men didn't hear, and stuff like that. But ultimately, what's going on in Acts 22 is this is Paul. We sort of see Paul in himself giving his own account of what happened, where it seems like in Acts 9, it's just simply sort of being recorded for us, the story of Saul on the road to Damascus. So look at that verse 1. He's going to say, brethren and fathers, hear my defense before you now. What does defense mean? What is that word? I'm sure you've heard it before. It's the same as Peter would say, be ready always to give a defense for the hope that was in you. What word do we get in our sort of our English language from that word defense? Yeah, apology, right? Apologia. He says, okay, I'm going to stand up. Of course, we've talked about before that that word apology is not the same as we think about apology. We think about apology sometimes as, I need forgiveness for something. Let me tell you about my wrongdoings. Let me appeal for forgiveness. But when we see that word defense, apologia in the scriptures, it is literally that. It's making a defense for the gospel. And so that's what he's going to do. He's going to use that word. We're going to see that word, I think, 8 times in Acts. And I think 7 of those times are used just between Acts 22 and Acts 26. And so that's really what the last part of the book of Acts is about. It's about Paul's sort of journey now of giving a defense for the things that he's been accused of. And it's going to go on for a few years in a few different locations. We'll see kind of how far we'll get this morning. In verse 2, it says, when they heard that he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, they kept all the more silent, and then he said. What's the significance there where he speaks Hebrew, which is their native tongue? What is the significance of that, do you think? Right, yeah, because that's really a lot of what his defense is going to be here from the beginning, is the idea of them understanding that he's, in a sense, one of them. He's been brought up just like them. So let's read there, which again, it's significant in a way that the way that he gives his defense here is different than he would usually stand before a crowd. Because usually when he stands before a crowd, he would start to preach to them scriptures and talking to them. But here he's sort of in a different situation, and so he's going to talk to them differently. He's going to make sure, do they understand who I am? So let's read there, verse 3 through 5. He says, I am indeed a Jew born of Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in the city of the feet of Gamaliel. I was taught according to the strictness of our father's law, and was zealous toward God as you all are today. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women, and also the high priest bare me witness, and all of the council of the elders, from whom I also received letters to the brethren, and went to Damascus, and to bring in chains even those who were there to Jerusalem to be punished. All right, so if you just stop there and you think about the first couple of ways that he sort of introduces his defense, what comes to mind the way that he's sort of describing his upbringing here? Did anything particular stick out to you? Think about one message he wants to get across to them, because one of the things he's being accused of is not showing reverence for the law. And so what does he use to describe that he does have reverence for the law? He says, I've been brought up to revere the law. He tells them where he was born. And that's sort of significant because you think about at this particular time, maybe a lot of the people there didn't remember Saul of Tarsus. I mean, you're talking about probably a 20-year period, something around that fact, from the time that Paul actually was Saul, lived in Jerusalem, was doing some of these things till now. A lot can change in 20 years. And so he is, one thing wants them to know that, I have reverence. I revere the law. I was brought up in the law. I was born a Jew. He also talks about his education. Why would that be significant for him to say, well, I was educated or I was brought up by Gamaliel? Who is he? Did we ever come across his name anywhere else in Scripture? Yeah, we see his name a couple of times. And in fact, scholars say he has probably, been dead probably 5 years. He has passed away, but yet he still sort of has this reverence because he was one of the highest teachers. He was one of the revered teachers of the day as far as being a rabbi. And so when it says, like, for example, when it says things like, he was brought up, I can't remember exactly, what is the words? He said, yeah, I was brought up in the city at the feet of Gamaliel. That's exactly sort of a descriptive term of how they learned back in the day. In fact, all the students would gather sort of around the rabbi. They would sit on the floor, and then the rabbi, the teacher, would be the one that would maybe sit on the stage or sit in front of them and teach them. So he's being very literal when he says, I sat at the feet. This is how I learned the law. And so he wants them to know that I revere the law, I understand the law, I know the law, I'm not going to disrespect the law. He doesn't sort of directly address some of the charges that's against him as well here, right? He understands that he's speaking. I guess what he's been charged of is I'm speaking. You're speaking against the Jewish people. That'll come up here in a little bit. I've dishonored the law. Instead, what does he say right here about the law? He says, well, and ultimately he's saying, I'm proud to be a Jew. I'm proud of my heritage. I'm proud that I was brought up. He says, I'm brought up to be zealous for God. What is he trying to get across to sort of the mob that is very angry at him at the time? What is he doing? He wants them to, he wants them to understand where he's coming from. And in a sense, he wants to say, well, I'm just like you. I'm zealous for doing what's right. Now, obviously, as we'll see later on, they sort of think they're in the right at this moment in time, which they're not, but they're so zealous for God and the law and not just defiling the temple that they have these accusations against Paul. I think another thing Paul's trying to do is maybe he's trying to calm down. Maybe he's complimenting, if you would use that particular word, about who they are, about their zealousness. It wouldn't be too far removed from sort of his approach. Remember in Acts chapter 17, when he's talking to the men of Athens, what is the first words that comes out of his mouth as he preaches to them about the unknown God? What does he say to them at the very beginning? I perceive that you are what? You're very religious, right? Sort of a complimenting of understanding, where these people are at this particular time. He doesn't, I guess the opposite approach we would say sometimes is you think about, the first Christian martyr, Stephen. And what was his words to his audience that were very angry at him at the time? He comes out and talks, uses terminology that just made them even angrier and ultimately stoning him. So I say those things that he's basically trying to say here that I understand why you're wanting to kill me. Like, I understand your perspective because I know your background, because I have your background. And even where he would go and he'll say, he's not making that up. That's why he would say, the elders here, the high priest, they know me. They know my past. They're old enough to know what I used to be. And so it's not as if he's just making up things and saying, well, yeah, I'm a Jew. I was born here. I learned under him or there. There are those, even in the audience, that would be on the opposite side of him that are angry with him that could testify on his behalf to say, well, yeah, that is who Saul used to be. That, yes, we remember when he went to Damascus. And so that opens up where he starts in verse 6 and goes through verse 16 where he talks about his particular conversion story on the road to Damascus, something that's very, very familiar to us. I guess the thing that I would consider the most is maybe one of Paul's messaging he's getting across here as well is like the furthest thing from Paul's mind when he was on the road to Damascus was following Jesus, wasn't it? Like that was the furthest from what his intentions and what his plans were. How do we know that? What was he on the road to go do? What was he carrying with him? Was he not carrying, the papers to go attack and imprison more Christians? So the furthest thing from his mind was, to be a follower of Jesus. But that's what happened. Let's pause for a moment. I guess maybe a practical application we can make for us when we do have sort of disagreeing views with those, whether they're of the world or whether they, perceive to be religious. How do we handle those things? Paul doesn't always handle every situation the exact same way, but in this particular situation is something that, we talk about sometimes when you're going to sit down and study with someone. Where's the first place you should start a lot of times? What do you hear a lot of times when we talk about personal evangelism, we talk about personal studies, what is one of the common, what's the word I'm looking for? Not really examples, but what do we typically tell people? Well, one of the first things you want to do if you're sitting down with someone and trying to study the gospel with them, do we not say something to the effect of, let's find some common ground. Let's find a place where we can start. And so for some people that may be, the Bible is the inspired Word of God. For some people that may be, Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Some place that may be, Jesus is the Savior. He was perfect. He resurrected. Wherever that is, it's sort of like you start on some common ground and then let's move into. So we have something to base our discussions and our Bible studies off of instead of going directly to, as Paul would do. He didn't start directly and just started making a defense for himself and say, no, I didn't do these things, and this is why I didn't do these things. Instead, he appeals sort of to their humanity, appeals to their history, appeals to, well, where do we have common ground? Well, I'm just like you. I've learned how to be zealous for God. So one other thing I'll just point out in the actual the conversion story there, he talks about, and this was something that, as we'll see, sort of the crowd at some point will stop him because they get riled up to the things he's saying. But if you look at verse 7, he says, I fell to the ground, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And I answered, who are you, Lord? He says, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. What would have been, just imagine, what would be going through their mind when they heard Paul as he is sort of rehashing his conversion story, and now all of a sudden he says, well, it was Jesus of Nazareth that was talking to me on this road. Would they have liked that? Would they have agreed with that? Or would that have made them more angry? And even when he's telling this sort of reenactment of what happened, when they hear Jesus of Nazareth, well, that's not an unfamiliar term to them. They would have heard Jesus of Nazareth. In fact, later on, I think it's in the next chapter, it may be in chapter 24, where again that sort of Nazareth or Nazarene will be brought up again, referring to Christians, and sort of what is the official position of the Jews of what happened to Jesus of Nazareth? When Paul is saying, it was Jesus of Nazareth talking to me, what was their position about Jesus of Nazareth? We'll go back to the very end of Matthew. What did they say happened to Jesus of Nazareth that was put on the cross and that was put in the tomb? What was going to be their story? What was their story of what happened to the body? Yeah. Their position is, well, the body, Jesus of Nazareth's body, was stolen. That is our official position. Now you're telling me years later, Jesus of Nazareth comes and speaks to you. That, again, is something that would be more of a sort of a conflict and anger to them. And so he goes on and he talks about meeting Ananias, being baptized, and gives that story. But you see at the very end of verse, I think it's 21, when it talks about, depart, for I will send you far from here to the Gentiles. And that's at that point when they hear that statement, they are sort of fed up. They stopped listening to Paul, because that was another sort of point of contention with the Jews, that Paul is going around and he's teaching the Gentiles about Jesus and about having a relationship with God. And so at this point, they're going to get angry. They want to kill him again. So the Roman commander, what's he going to do? He's going to have to basically put Paul in the barracks again. They're going to lock him up. And in fact, they want to do something else to Paul there at the end of 22. What do they want to do with Paul? And maybe it's to get the answers that he needs. But what do they want to do there? What is the Roman, I guess the Roman commander, what does he suggest in verse 24 that they want to do? They want to scourge him, right? What was the problem with that? Yeah. Paul sort of at the last moment almost, oh, by the way, I'm a Roman citizen. Well, what's the big deal with that? We know what scourging is. We know about the beating, that few would survive that. But why would this be, again, significant? There, verse 25, they stretch out his hands, they're ready to beat him. And some would say maybe that's a prophecy back to what Abacus would say in chapter 21. But what is the point of, obviously Paul says this to get him out of the beating, but why would that, again, be significant to part of the story here? What could you not do to a Roman citizen? Right. You couldn't scourge a Roman citizen. And so now here's the whole situation you're dealing with. You have a mob who is angry at Paul and making accusations against him. So much so that they want to kill him. The Roman commanders and the army comes in to, in essence, save Paul from this beating. But the problem with that is the Roman commander at this time, he still doesn't know, why are they trying to kill Paul? That's what the Roman commander is trying to get to. He's trying to figure out, okay, what are the accusations against Paul? Why are you trying to beat him? Well, the problem with them trying to scourge and even do these things is, if you're a Roman citizen, you have certain rights. And so it's really a situation where the commander has found himself in a jam, because he has sort of locked up Paul, trying to get to the bottom of the situation, but yet you can't hold a Roman citizen sort of imprisoned or in chains if you haven't informed him of what his accusations are. And the Roman commander can't tell him what his accusations are because he hasn't found out from the crowd yet, because the story is not matching up. So that's kind of the beginning of what's going on here when you sort of see this back and forth. And so what do they decide to do? They're going to sort of, the next step here in 23 is he's going to sort of pull Paul back, and the next day, the Roman commander, in his authority, he is going to call on the Sanhedrin. He's going to call the council together, and maybe if it dies down the crowd in a sense, and he gets those that are just the religious leaders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees together, and says, okay, now here's the next day. We go into Acts 23. Okay, now that we're here, now that we've had a few hours to settle down, okay, now let's get to the story. What is the issue here that you have with this particular person? And in the first 5 verses there of Acts 23, Paul is going to sort of confront the high priest about what's going on with him. Look there in verse 1 of 23. Paul, looking earnestly at the council, he said, men and brethren, just like he said in 22, I have lived in all good conscience before God unto this day. What's he saying? Is now you would think a little more of a, not necessarily a court scene, but a little more than just, you would think, on the side of the road, kind of, oh, let me speak to the people, oh, let me find out. But it's more of a, I don't know if you necessarily an organized situation, but again, he's able to speak, and he says, I live my life. What is his defense there. Well, I've lived as a good Jew. I haven't broken any laws. That's what you're accusing me of. He says, I have a perfectly good conscience before the Lord, talking about his actions. The result of this is Ananias, the high priest, is going to want to, he tells them essentially, will somebody hit him in the face or slap him? There's another sort of confrontation there in which then Paul will call them, he'll use a particular word, whitewashed walls. Look there at verse 3. Paul says, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Well, what's a whitewashed wall? We ever came across that particular sort of terminology before? Maybe you had some footnotes or side notes there. Does anybody have one that references all the way back to Ezekiel by chance? Ezekiel will use this particular phrasing. I think it's, Ezekiel chapter 13, where he talks about comparing the false prophets to the crumbling walls that was going on in the city, and he said they had to basically whitewash them to cover up their flaws. And so he's calling these high priests that are bringing these accusations the same way. It'd be the same terminology. You remember Jesus, what did he say about the Pharisees? Did he not call them, what did he call them at one point in time in Matthew 23? Yeah, he said, you whitewashed tombs. Yeah, that's exactly the words Jesus would say. On the outside, hey, it looks great, but on the inside, it's death, right? And so there is a little bit of confrontation where Paul will, scholars are sort of back and forth on whether he is apologizing or not to one particular mention here where it says, did he know that the person that did this was the high priest or not? But regardless, he's going to go through here in verses 6 through 20. He's going to at some point bring up the resurrection. And what is that going to do when you have in front of the Sanhedrin, when you have Pharisees and Sadducees, and he brings up the resurrection? What is the natural conclusion from that? Do those two particular groups agree on that particular issue? They don't agree with it. The Sadducees are ones that didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead, and so instead of them now focusing sort of on Paul, now the attention has become to them sort of having a sort of disagreements among themselves about what Paul is saying about the resurrection of the dead. Ultimately, what I'm saying is this doesn't get the answers that the council was brought together to begin with. You still have sort of this Roman commander, the ones in charge, still trying to figure out, okay, what are the exact accusations that they're trying to bring upon Paul? And so again, he's still sort of stuck in a jam here of what's going on. Now, I will bring up verse 11 there, because it is sort of significant to sort of the future of what's going to happen, and probably a story we'll get into next week, but I want to bring it up now. Look at chapter 23 at verse 11. It says, "But the following night the Lord stood by him and said, 'Be of good cheer, Paul, for as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must also bear witness to Rome.'" Now, on the surface level, you could kind of just read that and say, okay, Paul's doing what he's supposed to do, speak in the name of God, defend himself, But what is going to be more significant for Paul's, I guess, I don't know if you'd say necessarily comfort level, but Paul's view on what he's going through right here and now in Jerusalem. What does that tell him?
You're not going to die yet.
Right. He says, I know the mob's after you. I know they've already tried to kill you. I know but you're going to testify in Rome on my behalf. So that's allowing Paul to understand that God is with him. He's not going to die there in Jerusalem, which is part of what's going on there in the rest of that chapter, which is significant because 12 through 22, what is the next step for the Jews that haven't gotten their justice that they think they deserve right now? What are they going to do? What's their next move? Right? They're gonna do the same thing they did Jesus. They're gonna conspire to kill Paul. And so even you have these, I think it says these 40 men that are going to make this vow. And what was the vow they said? We will not eat or drink until Paul's dead. That's not the first time. We see a few other occasions in the Old Testament, one of them being, you remember King Saul had made sort of a vow to tell his men, his soldiers, not to eat until David was brought. And he had sort of the confrontation between Jonathan, who didn't hear, and then Jonathan came by and ate some of the honey. So you have a couple of occasions where this sort of vow, this sort of idea of taking a vow in the name of God takes place, whether that's right or wrong. In fact, one of the commentaries pointing me back to, let me read real quick, John 16, at verse 2. It says, they will put you out of the synagogues. Indeed, the hour is coming when whoever kills you will think he is offering service to God. As Jesus sort of lays out what is in store for his disciples. This is another one of those occasions where people think they're doing it in the service of God. Let me make a vow to God, I will not eat or drink until Paul is killed. Well, apparently they had to break that vow because what happens? In a nutshell, Paul's was his nephew that finds out about what's going on, and so he runs and tells Paul. Paul sends him to the Roman commander. The Roman commander then gathers up, I think it was 200, if I'm not mistaken, of soldiers. He says, get the horses, get them together, and in the middle of the night, I think it was, we're going to take and get one for Paul as well, and we're going to just send him off. We're going to send him to Caesarea. And who is in Caesarea that we're going to come across this sort of next phase as you move on to Acts chapter 24. At the very end of 23, it talks about this letter that has been written, and it shows up to Felix. Felix is going to be the governor there. And then you move on to, like I said, Acts 24, where this basically, again, you're sort of rehashing what's going on. The Jews wanted to kill him. The Romans stepped in, but they can't actually accuse him because they don't know what he's being accused of. And so finally he just ships him off to Felix, the governor. And that's when you get to Acts 24. So what do we see in Acts 24? He talks about there's going to be a few days that passes by that eventually the high priest, there's going to be a lawyer there. They're going to show up on behalf of sort of this, I guess you would call it a trial, to present their case against Paul. It's about 60 miles that they would journey to get there. And this is what we would probably technically consider like the first trial that Paul would go through in Caesarea at least. And one of many years that he's going to spend about 5 years, we would say probably spent in prison, sort of trying to figure this whole situation out. So Felix here, he is going to be a little bit different in the fact that he's the judge and the jury. You know, he gets to make the decision. And so the Jewish leaders, knowing that, they're sort of going to, I guess the way that they talk to Felix is they're going to try to butter him up a little bit, as we would say, a precious or most excellent Felix, let us not weary with you any further. It's sort of like, let's just quickly get this over with. Let me tell you what this guy did, and so we can be out of your hair, we can go on our way, and we can take care of Paul. So you start there in chapter 24, and starting in verse 4, they're going to make their accusations against Paul. The first accusation is they're going to make it personal. Nevertheless, not to be tedious to you any further, I beg you to hear by your courtesy a few words from us. We have found this man a plague. Some of your versions may use the word pest. He is causing trouble. He is a troublemaker. That's the first accusation they make against Paul. That's why you need to let us take care of Felix, because he is a troublemaker. Personal attack. And then you move on to, they're going to make a political attack against him, a political charge. They say that Paul, he's basically stirring up dissensions among the Jews, and they don't say just to Jerusalem, they say throughout the world, right? Now that would appeal to Felix, because part of Felix's job as the governor was, in the Roman government, was to keep peace. And so if you have someone that is causing dissension, that is causing problems and rioting, well, that would affect Felix. So you see, again, why they would sort of attack him in this particular way is because, well, he's causing problems for you, Felix, among the communities. So they make that sort of announcement. In fact, that's what I was talking about, the Nazarenes. Let's see. Where did they say that at? Let's see. The end of verse 5. They say, throughout the world, he's a dissension throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Now that's, again, sort of an interesting sort of terminology. Why would he call them the sect of the Nazarenes? Again, what does that go back into apply to? That implies, they are just a sect, a group over in the corner that's following this Jesus of Nazareth. Right? They didn't look at them. He's sort of like discrediting the legitimacy of them. And also,
nothing good has ever came out of Nazareth.
Right. You go all the way back to the 1st of John. What was the sort of the standard of what everybody thought? Well, who is this? Nothing good could come out of Nazareth. So again, it's sort of a discrediting of who this man is and who he's the ringleader of this particular sect that's causing dissension among all the Jews in the world because he's a troublemaker. So see, they're setting their case before Felix. This is who Paul is. And then they give a religious charge at the end. And I don't know if you necessarily read it this way. Let's see, where are we at? He even tried to profane the temple, and we seized him and wanted to judge him according to our law. So 2 particular things that are interesting in that section. The first one, he says, what was the way they worded it? He even tried to profane the temple. Well, isn't that different than what they accused him of to begin with? What did they say originally? Originally, it was he did profane the temple because he brought this Gentile into the temple where he shouldn't belong. But now they're sort of backtracking a little bit and say he even sort of he tried to. And another lie that ultimately they told here, what was the lie in the second part of that verse there, in verse 6? Yeah, their story now among the Roman government, Felix, is we tried to seize him. We wanted to judge him. That's not what they wanted to do. What did they try to do to him? They tried to pull him out, and they were just going to kill him right there on the spot. That doesn't sound like a trial. That doesn't sound like, innocent until proven guilty. Let's get all the facts straight. So again, they're sort of, now that they are being held accountable officially to the Roman government, it's sort of they have to lawyer talk, as we would say sometimes. Again, that may be the reason why it says that they brought this lawyer with them, because they wanted to make sure, well, we need Paul. Let's say exactly, let's don't get trapped in anything. And so they give him all these charges. Right, yeah. It's very similar to the way that they treated Jesus in this fact, that false accusation after false accusation, and it's just, well, let's just get rid of him. He doesn't deserve, a trial. Did I just hear a bell? Was that the first bell? Yeah. I'm counting on you, Joe. You're closest to the door. That's the first bell? Okay. If you hear the second bell, just wave. All right. Let's kind of finish this chapter off at least. So starting in verse 10, Paul is going to now give his defense. And I find it interesting here, and probably not what the Jewish leaders wanted, but instead of asking Paul, okay, we're going to question Paul about this or that, they basically just gave Paul the floor and let him sort of speak on his behalf. Not something you would typically think, as we would think about today's standards of being on a trial. You would have, again, this sort of back and forth, let me ask you this, let me ask you about this. They accuse you of this. He just gave sort of Paul the floor. One of the defenses he's going to give there, where he talks about, 12 days, and I'm not necessarily sure if he's talking about 12 days in Jerusalem, if he's talking about the 7, and then it took 5 days for them to get there. But either way, sort of one of Paul's points here is, look, you're accusing me of being a disruption, causing riots, and not just causing riots in Jerusalem, but all over the world. And he's saying, how could I have incurred up, that much trouble in less than 2 weeks? So he's giving Felix sort of a doubt on that. You read verse 13 and verse 14, where he says, nor can they prove the things of which they now accuse me, but this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect. So he's going to make a distinction. This is not just a sect. It's not just a particular movement that's going to come and go, but this is the way. He said, so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets. Again, going back to the idea that he's not necessarily against the law and the prophets, but he understands the context in which the law was written and how to view the law in view of now the way, Jesus and the resurrection and so on. So he's going to say, you can't prove the accusations against me, but he does admit. He admits that he served God, the God of the fathers, which they would again have to come back and say, because their view would say, well, we serve the God of our fathers as well. He's going to conclude there in verse 20 and 21 with a sort of a direct challenge to the people that are accusing him. He said, the only thing I'm guilty of is doing the job that I was told to do, and that is to preach Jesus Christ, to preach the resurrection of Jesus. And so that's going to lend itself, as Felix, as you'll see, he's going to procrastinate, and he doesn't make a decision about Paul. And so he's going to essentially put Paul what we would call not necessarily prison, but sort of house arrest. And he's going to spend the next 2 years sort of there. And it says, Felix will call him on occasion and talk to him and have conversations with him. And we'll pick up there next week, just a little bit of that, the end of 24, and then we'll just start in 25, and we'll see how far we get. We know in 26 he'll go before Agrippa, and then in 27, 28 he'll finally go to Rome, and there's a shipwreck and things. So we'll see how far we can get. So I guess we'll start, just plan on next week, we'll start in Acts 25. Let's go ahead and we'll close out in prayer at this time. Our God and our Father, we thank you so much for the knowledge that you've put before us in your word, that we can have a knowledge of you, and we can gain wisdom and understanding by your holiness. And we're thankful for just the things that we're able to study when we come together in our Bible studies, to know what your will is, to see your plan working through and through. And we're thankful for the life of Paul and the example he sets for one that was willing to go to great lengths and to even put his life on the line to serve you and to honor you, and help us to be just as bold and courageous. Continue to be with us throughout this day. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.